Hello and welcome to the India Energy Hour. I am Sandeep Pai, a former journalist with Hindustan Times and now an energy researcher at the University of British Columbia.
And I'm Shreya Jay, journalist with Business Standard newspaper in Delhi, writing on the energy sector.
Together, we are really excited to co host a new podcast on India's energy transition, the India Energy Hour. This podcast is hosted by 101 Reporters, an innovative news agency that connects grassroots reporters and media houses to bring out untold stories. The show is produced by Tejas Dayan and Sagar of 101 Reporters.
In this podcast, we want to unpack and document India's energy transition. We will interview leading energy, development, and climate experts from academia, civil society, and the government. Through these interviews, we will explore the most pressing hurdles and promising opportunities in the energy transition unfolding in India. We will examine the role of government, finance, social justice, and science. Over time, we will feature other countries of the global south as well.
G7 nations, or group of world's most advanced economies of Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the United Kingdom, and the United States, are reportedly planning to ban all fossil fuel finance globally. In fact, G7 has already declared its intention to stop international funding for coal projects. This fossil fuel finance ban could have an adverse impact on countries in the global south who are trying to balance their growing energy needs while taking action on climate change. To understand this decision of G7 and its far reaching repercussions, we spoke with Vijaya Ramachandran, Director for Energy and Development at the Breakthrough Institute in the US. Vijaya is a renowned economist with over 3 decades of experience working in public policy and academia. She has served on the faculty of Duke University and Georgetown University, as well as worked at the World Bank, the Executive Office of the Secretary General of the United Nations, and the Center for Global Development. Hello, everyone. Hello, Vijaya. Thank you so much for joining us. We are delighted, very, very excited to learn so much from you, to hear your views on multiple issues that we are going to discuss here. And I've read your work, some of the recent work, some of the past work, and I just love your views, and they have been much, much enlightening. So thanks a lot for joining us today here, and we can't just wait to start here.
Thank you so much, Shreya. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. So let's get started. I want to know about your story. So you have a very fascinating, interesting story. You did your PhD and then you worked with like all sorts of international organizations, the World Bank and UN, and now you're at Breakthrough. Tell us like your story. Like, where are you from? How did you get interested in this field? And now I think you've been doing this for the last few decades and so on. So please tell us your story, like from the beginning.
So I'm from Bangalore originally. So I know that that's where 101 Reporters is based. So I was delighted to see that. I have lived in the US a long time. I moved here to go to college. So it has been several decades now. In terms of the career, I think I've always been interested in international development issues just because I was raised in India, always interested in issues related to growth and to poverty alleviation, and trying to figure out what works and what makes sense to do, and so on. After I got my PhD, I taught at Duke University for several years in the public policy school, helping to set up a quite large international program for mid-career professionals from countries around the world to come and get a public policy degree. And I really enjoyed doing that. After that, I went to the World Bank. I've had a couple of stints at the World Bank. And while I was at the World Bank, I became involved in a project that I'm still involved with, which is called the Enterprise Surveys. And it was started by Nick Stern when he was chief economist of the World Bank. And the idea behind it was to survey businesses in poor countries around the world and try to understand what constraints they face. And I think in terms of the World Bank's own approach, it was transformative because to date, the bank had focused very much on public sector interventions and on macroeconomic reforms and so on. Launching the enterprise surveys was an effort to really understand how the private sector works across different countries in Asia, in sub-Saharan Africa, in Latin America, and in Eastern Europe. And the surveys continue to date. So now, every country has several rounds of surveys. There's like the equivalent of the household surveys that the bank also does. And as a result, we can say a lot about, the kinds of constraints that businesses face, and the sorts of problems they encounter as they go about their sort of daily work. And one of the things I noticed in the enterprise surveys, and it's still very obvious, is the very significant extent to which access to reliable electricity is a problem. In sub-Saharan Africa, in many countries, businesses rank access to electricity as their largest problem, their most significant problem. And power outages can run several hours a day. And just, from a common sense perspective, it is incredibly difficult to do any kind of manufacturing or even any kind of service-related work if you are experiencing power outages of 3 or 4 or 5 hours a day. So that sort of has sparked my interest in energy access issues, and it's something I've been interested in for a long time.
To start with, I just wanted to understand from you that what are the different mechanisms that G7 or the world's most advanced economies of Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, United Kingdom, and United States, these countries do to support developmental projects, including fossil fuel, in developing economies such as India and other countries that you mentioned. If you can give us a brief on how this functions, how do they use different mechanisms?
Yeah, certainly. So there are a range of mechanisms that these different organizations use. But I think the main thing to remember is that the various countries have bilateral development finance institutions. So the UK, for example, has CDC. The US has the newly created US DFC, the Development Finance Corporation. France has Proparco. So there are these different bilateral institutions that help in terms of financing energy-related projects. And then there are the multilateral organizations that also do this, the largest of which is the International Finance Corporation, IFC, which is the private sector arm of the World Bank Group. And so across these different organizations, both bilateral and multilateral, and there are a few more, the other multilateral banks also have in private sector financing arms. So there's a few of these. But between these different institutions, both bilateral and multilateral, they finance energy projects in two ways, either by taking an equity stake or by offering debt-related financing. And the debt-related financing can often be concessional. If the countries are very poor or they meet the World Bank's IDA classification, which is an income threshold-related classification, then financing can be offered at a less than market rate. So these are the two main vehicles by which financing occurs. It's either equity stakes or it's debt. A number of the bilateral agencies take quite large equity stakes and often use equity as the primary instrument. The International Finance Corporation in 2019 committed about $1 billion of its own funds, taking equity stakes in companies. This is not just energy companies. This is the whole portfolio. So they do take equity stakes in these companies. And sometimes they will also take an equity stake through private equity funds. So they will be, one player in a private equity fund. So there's different ways in which they can finance energy-related projects, whether it be traditional fuels, fossil fuels, or renewable energy. These are the kinds of mechanisms that are available, both multilaterally and bilaterally.
So, a few months back, the media was reporting that G7 are planning to ban fossil fuels globally. And in response to that, you sort of wrote this piece in Nature, which I think was like shared and reshared, and people were tweeting about it. There were some who were like, "What is this?" The others were loving it, and I was in the other camp, which was loving it, and all the arguments were great. And what this quote really caught my attention, and I'm like quoting this. Seven European countries pledged to stop important support for fossil fuel projects abroad. They joined the United States and other European countries in stopping funding for energy infrastructure projects in poor countries that depend on coal, gas, and oil. This blanket ban will entrench poverty in regions such as sub Saharan Africa, but do little to reduce the world's carbon emissions. Can you just explain your line of argument and why you think this will be sort of like, this will entrench some of the regions into poverty?
So I think my argument on this issue is that poor countries need a lot of energy. They need a lot more energy to get to the levels of consumption that we enjoy. The average Ethiopian consumes energy in a year equivalent to the amount that the average American consumes in 4 days. So you get a sense of what the disparity is like. This is not a 10 or 20% gap. This is a gap, of several magnitudes of order. So my understanding is that, taking things off the table and making fewer energy sources available to poor countries is going to keep them poor. And, my sense on climate change and the response to climate change, we see a lot of stories of countries like Bangladesh, for example, that really suffered sort of devastating consequences every time there's a typhoon or a flood or, some sort of climate related event. And there's a lot of attention in the media to the fact that poor countries suffer a great deal from the consequences of climate change, but they suffer because they are poor. It's because buildings are not resilient. It's because infrastructure is not developed. It's because housing is, extremely vulnerable to typhoons and to climate shocks. In order to build resilient infrastructure and to build economies, to make people richer, so that they can go to school and they can study when they want to, and the schools have reliable electricity and homes have electricity, we need to invest in a whole range of energy sources. And we need to really increase energy consumption from current levels. This is all across the developing world, from middle income countries all the way to very poor countries. There is a very significant energy gap in most of these countries. And we really need to focus on that first and try to understand how much energy investments will be needing to get people to a high energy future, the way, enjoying the levels of consumption that we enjoy. I think that's my primary focus. With that in mind, I think banning fossil fuels makes things very difficult for poor countries. I think it's okay to place some limits on coal because coal is largely not in play in many poor countries. In Africa, for example, it's only really in South Africa. Most countries are not investing in coal. I think for most poor countries, the big investment that looms in their future is in natural gas. And, many of them have very large untapped reserves of natural gas. And sub-Saharan Africa has around 600 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. This is a huge energy source. It burns cleaner than coal, twice as clean is my understanding. It can be extracted in ways that are not damaging to the environment. And there are newer technologies coming online. And so from my perspective, banning natural gas investments makes no sense in very poor countries that need a lot more energy to grow and become richer.
Right. So let me just follow up on that. You said, banning some coal projects is sort of okay, right? But what if, some of these countries argue that, we need every source, sort of like, why ban one versus the other? And so do you think, given that larger context, and I'm not saying that coal will be built in some of these countries, like you said, most of the coal in Africa is in South Africa. So, and beyond like the two power plants that they're building, I don't think it will grow further. So do you think like globally coal should be banned?
So I think the question is regarding banning the financing of coal projects, right, rather than the projects themselves. So the question then becomes, can countries do it on their own? Can they do it without multilateral financing? Because this is really about international financing. The projects themselves can move forward if the countries want them to go forward. My sense on coal is it's a pragmatic view rather than a view informed by philosophy. So my sense on coal is that the countries that are investing in coal can do so. They can get financing on international capital markets. They have their own resources. They can move forward with coal projects if they think this is essential to their growth. I think for very poor countries, coal is largely not in play. And so my worry about this blanket ban is more about non-coal sources. It's about the kinds of things that poor countries can rely upon to become richer and to have more energy available for homes and for businesses. And from that perspective, coal is not that significant. It's really natural gas that is in play here, and the international ban will affect African countries and more broadly speaking, very poor countries more than anyone else. Middle income countries can raise funds on private markets. They can raise financing on capital markets if they want to do so. The ban by the World Bank or the International Finance Corporation or the European bilateral agencies will mean that for poor countries, there's no financing available because they have a much harder time getting money on international markets. So I think that's kind of what made me write this essay in Nature. I'm sort of worried about who this will impact and what kinds of investments this will affect. To my knowledge, the investments that will be affected the most will be in natural gas, which is important for a variety of reasons. It's very, very important for the production of fertilizer, which Africa desperately needs because it desperately needs to increase its yields and grow more food and stop relying so much on imported food. And for that purpose, natural gas is a feedstock and it's not substitutable. That's the other thing that I try to emphasize in this essay. I'm looking at things that don't really have substitutes. So, people have commented on the Nature essay on social media and so on and asked me, well, if you can just change the price of wind and solar relative to natural gas, wouldn't that sort of solve the problem? So make, lots of investments in wind and solar and bring the prices down. And that will sort of solve this problem of needing to rely on natural gas. Well, it will for some things, but it won't for other things. For some things, there aren't substitutes. So it's not really possible to make fertilizer with wind and solar energy. It's not really possible to build roads with wind and solar energy. And roads is again something that sub-Saharan Africa desperately needs. So I think I'm looking at it from the perspective of, what do these countries need to grow quickly? And, are we doing ourselves a huge sort of disfavor by preventing them from developing infrastructure projects?
Could you mention about financing and money? Because that is one of the most intriguing part of these big announcements that developed nations continue to do. So recently, as part of the same announcement where they decided to, stop fossil fuel financing, the G7 also increased the climate financing to $2 billion as part of the same scheme. Before I jump into the question, I'd like to give a little past perspective. Is that in 2009 also, G7 had committed $100 billion of funding for poorer nation to meet their climate change mitigation plans. As per certain reports, they have met around $80 billion of the target, and that is mostly loans and not grants, which means that more financial burden on the poorer countries. And a lot of experts point out that this is more of a geopolitics against China, which is a rising energy economy, rather than financial assistance to global South countries and developing countries, sub-Saharan, etc. So, if you can give us a whole perspective on what do you think of the past actions taken and the current statements that have been made regarding climate financing.
Yeah, it's a sort of a complicated story, I think, but also one that reflects the changing priorities of rich countries, which we see at these G7 summits. So, the most recent summit, all these countries are coming off or starting to come off the COVID crisis. And the pandemic has resulted in enormous amounts of spending within their own economies, trying to support businesses, trying to vaccinate populations, and so on. So I think there is right now, probably relatively little appetite to announce very large amounts of money for climate financing. I find a $2 billion commitment to be extremely low. What are 70 plus countries going to do with $2 billion? It's not a significant amount of money in any sense. The previous commitments in 2009 that you mentioned were very significant. They were made at a very different time when these countries were in a very different place and, were not dealing with the pandemic and not dealing with their own domestic issues to such a significant extent. And I think these numbers change and the priorities change as the G7 countries deal with their own domestic politics, their own domestic situations. And it illustrates the fact to me that we cannot really rely on international financing for this transition. I'm expecting these countries to come through on these commitments. They might do so. They might do so at some times, but they might also not because of things that happen in their own countries or shifting priorities or, what have you. My own view is that developed countries, the G7 economies can probably be most useful by investing in new technologies to bring down costs. If they can do the upfront R&D on renewables, particularly on new kinds of renewables or on technologies that reduce the unintended consequences of renewables or make renewables more efficient. If they can invest in, for example, lowering storage costs for solar and for things where, storage has really become a constraint or is the binding constraint. That can be enormously helpful to poor countries. If the G7 economies or more broadly, the rich countries can bear that upfront cost and bear the risk of investing in these newer forms of renewable energies, then poor countries can benefit from the downstream effects of those technologies and from the commercialization, the large scale commercialization of, new technologies, the lowering of costs of these technologies. I think that's where they can be the most useful. These financing commitments, they sort of come and go. Sometimes they're realized, sometimes they're useful. Other times, they are overtaken by events. And so you don't really see much money materialize. I think subjecting poor countries to that kind of volatility in terms of aid flows and financing flows is extremely burdensome. It's really hard for them to rely on this kind of money when they already are very budget constrained. So my sense is that, I think investing in technologies themselves is probably the most useful thing rich countries can do.
I'd like to additionally ask one more thing here. Do you think that because of these flip flops that keep happening in terms of climate financing from the developed nation, is the reason that a lot of developing economies are now thinking of building a self sufficient financing pool for climate change mitigation? There's a private bill that has been floated here in India by an MP called Jayant Sinha, and he has talked about a self-sufficient pool for climate financing. There was this recent conference that was hosted by IEA, and there also a lot of African countries said that all you have to do is just give us more carbon space. We'll manage the money on our own for meeting our target. Do you see a shift there, and do you think it is a good idea?
I think it's a good idea because it creates agency. And that's very important, right, in driving the success of projects. If countries can own their own climate mitigation projects and drive their own mitigation agendas, that will be enormously helpful, I think, to all of them, and in terms of also assuring the success of these types of projects. So I like the idea from that perspective. I think the question is going to be, if there is sufficient will to create a funding pool, and if there are sufficient resources available to create that pool, and perhaps perhaps there are enough resources available globally to create such a pool and have it really be driven by poor countries and be based in a middle income country or a poor country. Maybe that makes a lot more sense than the kinds of mechanisms we're seeing now. We're certainly seeing a lot of shifting of priorities, I think, as the rich world is trying to cope with COVID. It has been very difficult for them to maintain aid levels. And, one of the things we've seen in the media, a lot of stories, is about how the UK has really slashed its aid budget. And that has affected projects and people all over the world. The UK is coping with now, I think, the third wave of COVID and has, a number of urgent domestic priorities, and has decided that it will cut its aid budget. That's the kind of thing that has sort of devastating impacts on poor countries. And so having a fund that is managed and kind of owned by poor countries might make a lot more sense.
Excellent. I just wanted to go back to that $2 billion funding. And so I did some back of the envelope calculation just to see, what that could pay for. And so just to give context, Coal India in India has something like $15 billion in royalty, taxes, salaries, pensions every year that they pay, right? So, and Coal India largely operates in 5 or 6 states. So it's what this $2 billion would really pay for is financing coal transition in one Indian state. That's it. So just to sort of give the context of what it can really give, and that, I think, if and that is the scale of what it is basically. So coming to sort of the next topic.
So Sandeep, I want to make one comment on that.
Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
So no, that's okay. I completely agree with you that the $2 billion for financing coal transitions, whatever that might be, is just a very, very small amount and won't accomplish much. The other thing I want to point out that is not in the communique is any attempts to reduce the G7 countries' own coal consumption. And this is kind of, where the hypocrisy plays in. And it's something that I mentioned in my Nature essay as well. It's both hypocritical and ahistorical to ask poor countries to cut their coal consumption or cut their natural gas consumption or not use any fossil fuels at all. The rich countries themselves are extremely reluctant to reduce their own coal consumption or to prevent further expansion of natural gas. The U.S. has, I think, 200 new natural gas projects in development. Many countries are considering natural gas as a source of fuel for new projects. So there is that sort of disconnect between what they're asking poor countries to do and what they themselves are doing. And I think it's worth calling them out on that.
And just one observation here. I would want to know if you agree to that or not. Good that Sandeep mentioned the example of Coal India. Given that it's one of the largest employer in the country, one thing that Coal India is now doing, given that the demand of coal is slightly falling, is now that they're reducing their employee cost. That means that going forward, every year, 5 to 10% of the workforce that goes out of work will not be compensated on. So I think with this reduced financing, with this energy transition, the first line that is affected are the employers and the lowest level. We're talking about mechanized operations. So what do you think of this impact?
This impact can be devastating for employees. And I think anybody who advocates transitions out of coal, either in the rich world or in the developing world, should be very aware of the consequences on employees. And as you mentioned, it's the lowest level workers that suffer the worst consequences. This is as true in India as it is in West Virginia, which has been coal dependent for generations. And there are families that are looking at these announcements around renewables and wondering what they're going to do next. where is the paycheck going to come from? How are they going to feed their families? I think any plan that involves transitions out of fossil fuels must prioritize safety nets for employees, employee retraining, employee relocation, all sorts of programs that, look at what works, figure out what makes sense for the local context. But there's no question that, transitions that don't think about what happens to workers can be really devastating to workers and to entire regions, because coal tends to be concentrated in certain regions. So you're actually wiping out a whole town or a whole region when you decide you're going to close a plant. I think policymakers in both rich and poor countries have to be very, very aware of that before they do, anything to facilitate these types of transitions in the name of climate change.
Fantastic. Yeah, I mean, that's something I study and I continue to work on. So I'm glad you brought that up. So let's bring sort of the focus back to India or other countries in Africa. I know that I wanted to pick your brain on that before, but glad I'm getting the chance now. You have done a lot of enterprise surveys in Africa and other countries, right? And so bringing that kind of experience, what you've learned from there, could you describe how, complete ban on, let's say, natural gas in Africa might impact some of those small scale industries, or any other example, a concrete example of how that could impact the region and their businesses?
Yeah, the natural gas ban would impact very substantially in agriculture, because sub-Saharan Africa is really looking to invest in raising crop yields. Sub-Saharan Africa has not undergone a sustained green revolution the way India has, or the way much of Asia has, or the way Latin America has. Yields in Sub-Saharan Africa are as low as a tenth of yields in India. They are very small compared to yields in India. Sub-Saharan Africa also has very little land that's irrigated. And that is in particularly sharp contrast to India, which is the most irrigated agricultural farmland in the world. So these are the kinds of things that African policymakers are trying to address. They're trying to invest significantly in fertilizer to raise yields. They are building fertilizer domestically. They're building capacity domestically, and they're importing fertilizer. All of that requires natural gas to produce. And it is by far the most efficient way to produce fertilizer. It's very difficult to substitute out of natural gas for the production of fertilizer. So I think this alone is very significant, because the food crisis and food production in Africa is such a significant issue for most countries and most policymakers. It's also an issue because Sub-Saharan Africa is yet to see the decreases in the price of food that will allow people to move to cities and work in industrial jobs and have access to cheap food. We don't yet see that dynamic in most African cities. Food is very expensive, in part because it's imported. And so this, to shift away from this situation that we're in currently to a situation where yields are high, food is cheap, agricultural productivity is high, and people are able to move to industrial sector jobs, we need investments in natural gas. We need to tap into these enormous reserves. As I mentioned earlier, Sub-Saharan Africa has 600 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, in about a dozen or so countries. And so tapping into that is going to be very important in terms of being able to raise agricultural yields and improve food production and reduce reliance on expensive imports. The other reason that natural gas, I think, is very important is that it can be liquefied and used in other, for other uses, including in various types of transportation. And that's, again, something that Sub-Saharan Africa lacks to a very significant degree. Feeder roads are either non-existent or not paved. There are very few sort of transcontinental roads. It's very hard to move goods by land. It's extremely expensive to move goods. There was an article in the Financial Times that said the cost of shipping goods from China to Nigeria is about the same as shipping it from the port in Nigeria to a point inland. So these are, really difficult transportation challenges that have to be met with investments in roads, investments in transportation fuels, investments in natural gas powered vehicles. And so for all of that, I think Africa needs as much flexibility as it can get, trying to sort of put limits on its energy sources while it's trying to develop is really very counterproductive to the idea of being able to cope with climate shocks and so on.
I wanted to add here that because of the COVID pandemic, the situation is already quite worse than it earlier was. And given the impact of the pandemic on, especially on the developing nations, investment in climate change or energy transition might take a backseat. So going forward, what do you think would be the impact on these countries because of this?
Yeah, I don't know actually what it's going to look like going forward, what next year is going to look like. My sense is at this point that the rich countries are more or less coming out of this crisis. But for many poor countries, the next year is going to be as bad as the last year. And in many countries, we are seeing new waves of infections, new variants emerging, and so on. It is going to be really challenging, I think, for these countries to do any kind of growth related investments when this pandemic is still playing out. I mean, one of the things that really needs to happen is the international financing facility for vaccines, COVAX, needs to be properly funded. And rich countries need to donate excess doses and, maybe waive IP rights, whatever it is that needs to happen to get people vaccinated faster would be enormously helpful, I think, to poor countries and making financing available for coping with the pandemic will matter a lot. So far, rich countries have done some things, but I don't think they've done enough to really make a dent in this crisis in poor countries. I think you're right that in the short term, it's going to be really hard to do other stuff. My hope is, maybe I'm being too optimistic, but my hope is that the next year or two, we will be able to get this pandemic under control, and we will be able to shift back to looking at these longer term priorities, infrastructure investments, and so on. I mean, it's certainly on the positive side, it's certainly the case that there is financing available. There is capital out there. There's private capital. There's capital available through the multilateral banks, and there's capital available from China. So there's certainly money available. I think it's just a question of, being able to get the pandemic under control. So these sorts of financing pools can be utilized.
Excellent. I'm glad you brought up China because I wanted to ask you about that. So obviously, at least internationally, and I completely agree. I mean, Canada is one of the signatories of the G7, and they've just bought a pipeline here. So, domestically, they have no issues in sort of like expanding fossil fuels, or they're not talking about winding down their major fossil fuel. Canada can talk about phasing out coal because there's no coal, but they will never talk about phasing out oil sands because it's their it's the coal of what coal is in India, the oil is in Canada, and so they'll never talk about domestically. But having said that, and the way you explain sort of is that, there should not be a blanket ban, but, to some degree, coal financing is okay and need not. Correct me if I'm interpreting sort of your answers correctly. Coal financing is okay. So I want to get to the point of like what kind of measures, what kind of criteria can be created, and this is more of a research question, right? Like, how do you? If I were to design a study to understand what kind of projects are okay to finance, and what kind of projects are not okay to finance, how would you go about it? I think you wrote this with one of your colleagues and came up with sort of like two different, energy needs and emission cut criterias and so on. So could you elaborate on that?
Sure. Yeah, I think, again, it's sort of informed very much by it's a pragmatic approach to looking at the situation. So our sense was I did this work with Jude Moore, a former Minister of Public Works in Liberia and a senior fellow at the Center for Global Development. And Jude and I were arguing that for very poor countries, give them the maximum amount of flexibility because they're not able to get the financing on international markets. I think that's always been my approach with these projects. I think for a country like India, there's plenty of financing available on capital markets. It's the poor countries that I'm really worried about with these bans. The bans don't really apply to countries that are middle income or countries that are rich. It doesn't matter what the international organizations are doing for the most part. It really matters for very poor countries. So we were arguing that, for very poor countries, give them the most flexibility. So below a certain income threshold defined by the World Bank's IDA classification, for example, allow them the most flexibility possible in terms of what kinds of projects they want to finance and co-finance the projects. That's where the flexibility would come in. But the other alternative, which was proposed by Todd Moss at the Energy for Growth Hub with his colleagues, Todd is arguing that let's look at some combination of some combination of income and emissions. And so countries that are very poor and that are very low emissions should be allowed a lot more flexibility than other combinations, along those two axes. So you can either think of just a straight income classification, or you can think of a combination of emissions and income. But either way, the idea is that don't apply this ban across the board. Think about what countries really depend on international financing and try to give them as much flexibility as possible, because you do not want to cut off their ability to grow, while also not putting any limits on yourself. That seems, both hypocritical and not good policy.
I wanted to ask that, you have dealt with this topic, you have developed, suggested several models for how this climate financing should be done. So I just wanted to ask you one interesting question, that if you were to be appointed as an advisor to G7, how would you advise these leaders to best deal with climate change issues, making sure that most of the nations have their developmental needs, especially the global south? How do you balance the both?
So I would do just that. Ask them to balance both, right? That's the most important issue, what you just mentioned. Balancing the energy needs and the development needs with the needs in terms of reducing emissions or addressing climate change. It's really important that they keep all of these objectives in mind and that they keep them in mind simultaneously. I think that's the biggest lesson. I think related to that, one can make the argument that keeping the development objectives in mind may actually also address the climate change objectives by making these countries more resilient to shocks. So there's that sort of point as well that I think is worth making. Reducing energy consumption in poor countries will not make them more reliant or more resilient. Keeping them, at low emissions is not going to make them more resilient to climate change. They need to become richer. They need to become more resilient. They need to have more resilient infrastructure. They need to have 24/7 electricity. If you want early warning systems to work, for example, you need electricity on a continual basis. So these are the kinds of things that I think is important to think through when you advocate certain types of policies. My fear is that it's very convenient to impose fossil fuel financing bans because it's very easy to do. You can do it through the multilateral institutions where these countries are the largest shareholders, and poorer countries have little to no voice. So it's very easy for these countries to do this sort of thing. It sounds good, and it also you can also do it without imposing any limits on your own consumption. So you don't have to impose limits on the US's coal consumption or Canada's oil sands or Norway's oil reserves or anything like that. You can just, have these bans imposed through your votes on the boards of these multilateral development banks. I think this is what I'm trying to argue is really a bad idea. We want poor countries to become richer. We want them to become more resilient. We want to keep in mind that development objectives are not orthogonal to climate change objectives. They're very consistent, and investing in development also means that poor countries will be able to mitigate the effects of climate change and adapt to the effects of climate change much better than if you keep them poor and you remove options for them to invest in their energy sector. So that, I think, would be my advice to the G7.
Yeah, that's kind of counterproductive, right? Your climate goals, if you're only thinking about mitigation, then perhaps, only perhaps. But if you're thinking about adaptation and sort of like, then you really need some of the, like, lots of energy to create that infrastructure. Speaking of that,
One point on that, Sandeep, if I may, sorry, just want to make one point on this. On the mitigation objective, sub-Saharan Africa cumulatively has been responsible for 0.55% of emissions. So a little more than half of 1% of emissions. On an annual basis, it's responsible for 4% of global emissions. So banning fossil fuel financing in sub-Saharan Africa is not really going to change the emissions profile all that much. This is, I think, partly why I feel like it's a very sort of convenient and prominent thing to do, but it doesn't really have any significant consequences for climate change. And it has devastating consequences for economic growth, which is why I think we need to keep these numbers in mind and remember that the vast majority of emissions are not coming out of the poor countries.
I want to ask something based on just my observation. In the past so many years, I've been listening the same statements from the developed nations. They have these kind of targets for the developing nations. They give the money, so they get to call the shots. But developed nations themselves have not put out their own targets. At the same time, you're seeing this emergence of China. You mentioned about sub-Saharan countries and African nations, where China is increasingly building its presence, be it infrastructure projects, even solar, mining of silicon, whatever. At the same time, India has been kind of in a thought leadership with this international solar alliance and everything. Do you think that there would be a huge geopolitical shift just because the developed nations have just been talking and not doing anything? And now the emergence of, countries like China who are ready to give money to African countries?
It's an important point, Shreya. I think the emergence of China is very significant. And China as a player for infrastructure financing is a huge player. And in sub-Saharan Africa, it has made a significant and visible difference in many countries. If you just visit sub-Saharan Africa, you visit countries like Ethiopia or Angola and so on, you will see these very large infrastructure projects that China is co-financing or investing in. I think this has changed everything. I think it is a big geopolitical shift. And it unfortunately has led to this conversation around competition with China, which I don't think is productive. The scale of Chinese operations around the world is very significant. And I think that the best way for other countries to sort of engage is to try to figure out what they can do that would be the most positive use of their funds in poor countries rather than, quote unquote, competing with China. I find that sort of line of argument somewhat counterproductive. And in some sense, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. There's no question that, China is investing in dams, it's investing in roads, it's investing in toll roads. There's some very beautiful roads in Africa that China has built for, sort of interstate activities, for commerce, for tourism, and so on. China is investing in hydroelectric power in a number of countries. It has demonstrated a willingness to invest in large-scale infrastructure projects that will drive economic growth in a way that the G7 has not in a long time. I think one good thing is that now, the institutions like the World Bank and so on are re-engaging on large-scale infrastructure projects. And that's a good thing because in many countries, this is very much needed to drive growth.
Right. I wonder if you have a sense of, or if you want to speculate about why they're talking about banning fossil fuels. Is it because of, the domestic climate movements? Is it because, they want to show that they're like, the G7 is doing They're serious about, there's obviously in the rich world, there is a lot of pressure on climate. Climate is a mainstream topic, as opposed to, let's say, in India, where climate is not yet a fully mainstream topic. So do you think the activism and sort of like the domestic pressure and politics has built them to do some things that they can easily do, which doesn't take away anything from their domestic operations?
It's a very good question, Sandeep. I think others know more about these domestic movements than I do. My sense is that climate change has become a very real concern, which is a very good thing. In the rich world, I think the Biden administration has made really significant effort to put climate change on the agenda, and that is very commendable, especially given that not much happened in the previous 4 years. So I think it's really important that this is on the agenda, that the rich countries are focused on it. We have COP26 coming up now in the UK later this year. So I think it's a good thing that we are thinking about climate change and that we are trying to address it. And it is true that climate change has very devastating consequences for poor countries in terms of being able to grow food, in terms of being able to survive typhoons and storms and so on. So I'm in favor of the emphasis on climate change and the amount of attention being paid to climate change in the rich world. I think where the problem is we are running into a very complicated set of domestic politics where, as you mentioned, in each of these countries, you have very significant constituencies around fossil fuels and large numbers of people depending on fossil fuels for their livelihoods. I think that's one constraint. The other constraint is sort of this transition it cannot happen overnight. So it's not as if we have substitutes very readily available. And we are beginning to understand the unintended consequences of renewables as well. So for example, there have been stories in the papers in California recently about how when richer households switch to solar panels, the fixed costs of the grid get distributed amongst poorer households. So in some sense, poor people are bearing the burden of this switch to solar energy. And it's not something that I think we thought through very carefully when we started subsidizing, solar panels and getting people to put them on their roofs. It seemed like a great idea, but these are the kinds of problems I think that are emerging. So we've got two things going on, right? We've got these constituencies that are very dependent on fossil fuels. And then we've got sort of this set of kind of complicated issues around renewables that we need to work out. And of course, storage costs is one. That's a very big deal. That's been a problem for a long time that we're trying to solve. So it's not like we can easily substitute. And rich countries are very high energy consumption, right? We consume an enormous amount of energy on a daily basis. So shifting away, I think, into renewables has proven to be quite difficult. And then the easy path, I fear, is to do these sorts of international bans and to appease certain constituencies or to give the appearance that significant actions are being taken, or maybe there's a genuine belief that Africa should not develop any of its natural gas. I don't know, but whatever the motivation is, I think the consequences can be really devastating for poor countries, and that's kind of what I'm worried about.
I wanted to ask that, given that what has been the dialogue till yet in this particular year, be it G7 or whatever the countries are coming up with their dialogue, later in the year in Glasgow, do you think degree Celsius carbon emissions will take a backseat? And now with the developing countries suffering more, the discussion would be more in terms of $1 billion than degree Celsius. And that's where, and do you think that that's how it's supposed to be? Because I think it's how it's supposed to be.
That's very interesting. I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen at COP26. Certainly, I think there will be a push from poorer countries to think about how they can best cope with shocks and with economic shocks and with the pandemic and with, all the things that they are dealing with. I hope that there is emphasis on that at COP26. I hope that they think about these things in a careful manner rather than just focusing on one target or, one particular number that's that's being talked about in the press in Western countries and not worrying about the kinds of much more complicated development challenges that poor countries face. I really hope there is enough emphasis on the latter. And I hope that India will make the case for that. They have in the past quite effectively. I hope they'll do so again.
Well, this has been such a fascinating conversation. I wanted to ask you, like, sort of like the last few questions. One is like, what are you working on now, and what do you think you will be focusing on in the coming 5 years or 3 years? 5 years is a long time. I take that back. Let's say 2 years. Yeah, I'd be curious. What would be your focus of research and work going forward?
So I am currently at the Breakthrough Institute in Berkeley, California, and I'm trying to build a program there looking at energy access for poor countries and what kinds of investments are most important for economic growth. That's going to be, I think, the focus of my work, including looking at investments from China and what sorts of investments China is making and what the impacts are, the development impacts are of those investments. I'm currently working on a paper looking at the lack of agricultural transformation in Africa and what kinds of investments we might need on a large scale that would truly transform agricultural yields across Africa. And I'm looking at four things. I'm looking at cold storage, investments in cold storage, investments in transportation, including in transportation fuels, investments in fertilizer, and other sort of infrastructure-related investments that could actually transform, the agricultural sector. And I'm making the case that for each of these things, the fourth thing I'm looking at is large-scale irrigation, and I'm making the case that for each of these things, you need very significant investments in energy. These are large-scale types of activities that require very significant energy inputs. And it's something that we can't let go of in favor of micro interventions, which currently dominates the landscape in terms of development thinking. People are very focused on individual sorts of behavioral changes or mechanisms targeted at households or at individual farmers, all of which is important. I'm not discrediting any of that, but I think we do have to keep in mind that if we really want to see a sustained shift in economic activity away from informal sector activity and away from low productivity agriculture, we will have to invest very, very significantly in things like cold storage and in fertilizer. And these are not things that can be done with small scale solar or with mini grids. Those things are helpful, but then we also need these large scale investments.
Thank you so much. We really, really enjoyed talking to you, and really it was a pleasure having you, and you strongly expressed very good, interesting views on what can be done and also proposed mechanisms and so on. So we really appreciate it.
Oh, no worries. Thank you so much, Sandeep and Shreya. Thank you so much for having me on this show.
Thanks a lot, and looking forward to all your work, reading it.
Thank you.
For more information about the podcast, visit us online at www.101reporters.com/podcast/the_India_energy_hour. You can also reach out to us on social media and send us your comments and suggestions. My Twitter handle is @SandeepPai with a double I, and Shreya's Twitter handle is @Shreya_J.